They called her just a wife, a beautiful ornament, polished for public display, a shadow beside a man who walked like he owned the world. No one noticed how quiet her smile had become. No one saw the way her eyes froze just a second too long whenever she looked at him. Because no one really looks at the woman standing beside the power, not until she stops standing there. But the story doesn't start with silence. It starts with a whisper that felt like a blade across her soul. That's what they called her, at her own anniversary party, by the woman her husband had been bringing into their home, their world, their bed. And she simply smiled. She didn't throw a drink, didn't scream. She walked away, elegant, controlled, but the storm inside her was just beginning to breathe. You see, Victoria Sterling wasn't born into power. She was built in 1949, the daughter of a man who died before she could say goodbye, but not before he passed on the blueprints of brilliance, software that could rewrite systems, power that could move the world. She inherited his mind, his intensity, his legacy, and then she married a man who saw all that and buried it. Richard Sterling, billionaire, charmer, predator in a tailored suit. He didn't marry her for her softness. He married her for her silence. But what happens when silence becomes strategy? What happens when a woman you dismissed as just the wife remembers exactly who she is and what she owns? Because what Richard never told the world was that the technology that built his empire didn't start in his hands. It started in hers. And while he kissed another woman at his anniversary party, Victoria wasn't falling apart. She was remembering passwords, patterns, files he thought she'd forgotten, remembering what it felt like to be seen, not as someone's accessory, but as the architect of something vast, something unstoppable. This story isn't about love. It's about the lie we call love and the freedom you find when that lie is finally shattered. Stay with me, because once you hear what she did next, you'll never forget her name again. She was never a charity case. She was the storm that no one saw coming. It started with silence, not rage, not tears, just silence. That cold, clinical kind of stillness that comes before a storm. Not the loud ones, the quiet ones, the kind that uproots centuries. Victoria didn't slam doors. She didn't throw his things out the window. She simply studied, listened, gathered. She moved like a woman folding knives into linen. Every conversation Richard had ever had with her about his company, she rewrote it in her mind. She remembered the way he spoke when he was drunk, loose, arrogant, how he bragged about loopholes, shell companies, offshores. "That's the game, baby," he'd say with a smirk. "The government plays you unless you learn how to play back." And she smiled then, the way women smile when they're pretending they don't understand. But she had always understood. Her father had made sure of that. The man who taught her to encrypt data before she learned to parallel park. The man who told her, never let them mistake silence for stupidity. Richard had mistaken both. That morning, she called Marcus Chen. Discreet, precise, the kind of investigator billionaires used when they wanted to destroy enemies quietly. Only this time, he was working for the quiet enemy. She told him one thing: "I want everything." And he delivered. Bank records, travel logs, phone transcripts. Scarlett wasn't just a fling, she was a liability, a known manipulator with sealed settlements in 3 states. And Richard? He had quietly funneled millions through trusts and dummy corporations, trying to move assets before the inevitable crash. But here's what makes this story different. Victoria didn't want to destroy Richard. She wanted to expose the entire ecosystem that allowed him to exist. Because Richard wasn't unique. He was a symptom, a system that praised charm over character, that made it easy for men to steal brilliance from women and sell it as their own, because somewhere along the way, someone decided that elegance meant silence, that grace meant obedience, that womanhood meant shrinking so a man could feel taller. Victoria was done shrinking, and the plan forming in her mind wasn't about vengeance, it was about restoration, restoring her name, her father's legacy, and maybe every woman who had ever been told she should be grateful for crumbs when she baked the bread. This wasn't going to be a comeback. It was going to be a reckoning. 3 weeks passed. Richard didn't notice a thing. That's how the powerful fall, not from a loud scream, but from the quiet rustle of a woman they thought too soft to sharpen blades. Victoria was no longer living in his house. She was studying it, every crack in the foundation, every hidden wire behind the walls. She moved through his empire like smoke, unseen, but in every room. She started with the patents. Her father, Dr. James Washington, wasn't just an engineer. He was a revolutionary, the kind of mind governments quietly watched, the kind of legacy men like Richard mine after the genius is dead. Victoria had always thought she was honoring her father by letting his work live through her husband's success. Now she realized she had been complicit in his theft. When she pulled the original licensing records, her hands trembled. Her name was there, owner, heir, inventor, and next to it, a signature, Heron scanned, dated, but not in her handwriting. He had forged her power of attorney. She felt the nausea rise like a tide, not because she was shocked, but because she wasn't. Somewhere deep down, she had always known. The silence she lived in wasn't ignorance, it was survival. A learned behavior passed down from every woman who had been told to smile while being erased. But no more. She gathered evidence like artifacts, emails, call logs, technical files stored on old flash drives she found buried in Richard's office drawer. He never even changed the passwords. It was always the same phrase, Sterling always wins. Arrogance, the fatal flaw of every man who believes he's untouchable. But here's what Richard never understood. Victoria had never needed his money. She was the fortune. The technology he had built Sterling Tech on, she helped design it in college, back when they were just two ambitious kids who pulled all-nighters and dreamed of shaping the world. She thought they were in love, but love built on theft is never love. It's a con with roses. She spent her nights drawing maps on her bathroom mirror. Names, companies, shells. She circled the rot like a surgeon marking a tumor. And then she made the first move, a single anonymous tip, to the SEC, and the machine began to shudder. The storm doesn't announce itself when it arrives. It begins with a whisper, a subtle shift in the air. That's how it happened. The morning Richard's assistant mentioned a routine inquiry from the Securities and Exchange Commission. He barely blinked. Just compliance stuff, he said, sipping his coffee. But Victoria knew better. She'd lived with the man for 8 years. She knew his tells. His fingers twitched. That's when she realized he felt it, the shift, the unraveling. He didn't know why, not yet, but something in his gut was waking up. And that's what made it delicious. Not revenge, revelation, watching the master of the universe begin to question his own immortality. Behind the scenes, Victoria wasn't working alone. Remember those 23 young minds she'd mentored through her charity? She'd kept in contact. Quiet lunches, late-night calls. A few of them were already working inside some of the top tech firms, cybersecurity divisions, AI research, financial auditing. And they owed her, not in the transactional way Richard understood loyalty, but the deeper kind. The kind that comes from someone believing in you before you believed in yourself. One of them, Jalen, had once told her, "You taught me code is language. that I could rewrite my life. And now he was rewriting hers. He was the one who helped her follow the data trail. Not just the patents Richard stole, but the shell companies he hid them behind, Cayman accounts, phantom board members, bribes disguised as consulting fees. It was all there, buried in spreadsheets and offshore folders, just waiting for someone to dig it up and whisper the truth into the right ear. And whisper they did. But here's the darker part, the part most people will never tell you. Institutions like the SEC, they don't care about justice. They care about headlines. They act only when there's pressure. Victoria understood this. So she created pressure. A leak to a financial blogger, a leaked memo on Reddit, a mysterious burner account tweeting anonymous screenshots that looked far too real. Within 48 hours, the hashtag Sterling Scam was trending. That's when the board members started calling. Richard wasn't panicking yet. No, not yet. He still thought it could be fixed with a donation, a golf game, a favor. But Victoria wasn't after panic. She was after collapse, and it had already begun. The man who once promised forever now slept soundly in the mansion she had helped him build, unaware that the woman he dismissed was about to rewrite everything. That morning, Victoria didn't cry, she didn't scream. She sat at the kitchen counter with her black coffee, her hands trembling, not with fear, but with the echo of revelation. What Scarlett had said wasn't just cruel, it was strategic. She'd been trained for this. Victoria realized this was a game, one she was never told she was playing. But she remembered something her father once said. They only hide the rules from players they fear. For the first time in years, Victoria opened the dusty old files her father had left behind. Patents, designs, systems, the very skeleton of what Sterling Tech had become. And buried deep in those diagrams was something terrifying. A watermark with her father's name and her own signature next to it. Richard hadn't just betrayed her, he'd stolen her birthright. Victoria wasn't just angry, she was awake. Revenge didn't come in a scream, it came in silence, in patience, in precision. Victoria reached out to the only man she trusted, Marcus Chen, a cyber intelligence consultant who owed her father his career. "I need you to prove what I already know," she told him. In 2 weeks, Marcus returned with digital proof that Richard had transferred her father's intellectual property into shell corporations before launching Sterling Tech. Everything Richard owned, every building, stock, asset, was stolen from the man Victoria loved most. But she wasn't going to take it to court. No, she wasn't looking for justice. She wanted annihilation. This wasn't about divorce. This was war. She called a meeting with her former students, young minds she'd mentored quietly for years. She didn't ask them to destroy Richard. She asked them to build something greater. "We're going to expose him," she said, "and we're going to do it in the language he understands. Power." Washington Systems was born in a basement, just like Sterling Tech once was. But where Richard built on theft, Victoria would build on truth. Each line of code was personal. Each patent reclaimed was her father's legacy returned. Her students worked tirelessly. This wasn't just a startup, it was a rebellion, and beneath the surface, Victoria moved like a ghost through the corridors of the elite, gathering allies, seducing investors with a whisper, not a pitch. She never mentioned Richard, but the right people knew. They could feel it, the storm building behind her calm smile. When an anonymous whistleblower sent documents to the SEC detailing unethical practices at Sterling Tech, no one suspected Victoria. That's because she was playing a game only Richard thought he'd invented. She let him believe she was broken. She let Scarlett. The announcement hit Wall Street like a detonation. Washington Systems, a female-led tech firm with unprecedented encryption capabilities, was going public. And they were doing it on the same day Sterling Tech was unveiling its newest software. The press flooded with comparisons. Analysts whispered, "Is this Victoria's company?" Richard laughed when he heard it. "She's a painter, not a CEO," he told his board. But he didn't laugh when two of his lead engineers resigned overnight and joined Washington Systems, nor when his biggest investor pulled out, citing ethical concerns. Still, Richard thought he could weather it. After all, hadn't he already erased Victoria once? But he underestimated one thing: a woman scorned who still owned the keys to your empire. Because what he didn't know is that Victoria never signed away everything. 3 days before Sterling Tech's launch, their servers crashed. Not permanently, just enough to cause panic, but enough to trigger suspicion from regulators, enough to drop their stock by 12%. Washington Systems issued a public statement: "Our tech secures against what others ignore." The subtext was clear, and so was the message: "We see you." Richard called Victoria for the first time in weeks. "What the hell are you doing?" he asked. She responded with silence, then hung up, because Victoria wasn't going to explain herself to the man who built his life on her father's corpse. Scarlett panicked. She begged Richard to fix it. But Richard had finally realized the truth. He hadn't married a fragile charity case. He'd married the architect of everything he thought he owned, and now she was taking it back. The night before Washington Systems' launch, Victoria stood on the rooftop of her new headquarters, smaller than Sterling's towers, but built with her own hands, her own mind, and her father's bloodline. She looked out over the city, remembering the woman she used to be, the one who wore the dress Richard picked, who smiled on cue, who whispered gratitude while being erased. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone sharper, someone colder, but someone real. She wasn't just reclaiming an empire, she was reclaiming herself. And beneath the weight of betrayal, she'd found something holy: her own power. "They wanted a princess," she whispered. "I became a war queen." The next morning, Washington Systems launched. The servers held, the code was flawless. The reviews were savage, in Victoria's favor. And then came the final blow: a leaked video. Scarlett, bragging at a private gala that she'd convinced Richard to steal from that clueless widow. The internet devoured it. Hashtags erupted. Investors fled Sterling Tech like rats from a sinking ship. Victoria made no public statement. She didn't need to. She had already won. Richard's empire was crumbling, not from fire, but from frost. Quiet, strategic. Washington Systems soared. Victoria became a symbol, not of vengeance, but of precision. She declined interviews, turned down magazine covers. But she did one thing that made headlines. She bought the Malibu house and gave it to a women's shelter. "I know what it's like to feel invisible," she said in a rare speech. "Now, no woman will be." The crowd wept, but Victoria didn't. Her tears were already spent, back in that powder room, on that forgotten night. What she gave now wasn't emotion, it was empire. And so the story ends, not with flames, but with a crown forged from silence. Victoria Sterling, once mocked as a charity case, became the kind of woman who didn't just survive betrayal. She engineered her rebirth. And in doing so, she reminded the world of a truth it keeps trying to forget. Never underestimate the woman in the background, because sometimes she's the author, and the ending, it's written by her. Now, if you've made it this far, you already know. This wasn't just a story, it was an awakening, a transformation hidden inside a tale of betrayal. If it stirred something in you, If you felt the weight shift as truth revealed itself, comment this phrase below twice. I see the shadow behind the smile. Type it twice. Let the algorithm recognize who's watching. And more importantly, let the world know who you've become. Because once you see the shadow, you can never go back to pretending it isn't there. The world called it a miracle. The rise of a widow with no corporate experience who toppled a tech dynasty. But miracles are illusions for the uninformed. What Victoria built wasn't born from luck. It was forged in silence, in restraint, in pain so dense it hardened into vision. You see, empires built on fraud rot from the inside long before they collapse. But empires born of betrayal, those don't just survive. They infect the system that tried to bury them. Every boardroom that once laughed at her now studies her strategy. Every woman told to stay in her lane now quotes her code. And every man who thought he could use her, own her, silence her, now remembers her name as a warning. So I'll leave you with this. Victoria's story wasn't about Richard. It wasn't about Scarlett. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about one woman remembering who she was before the world told her to forget. And once she remembered, she didn't just take back what was hers, she made the world remember too. That's what truth does when it's buried too long. It doesn't rise quietly, it erupts. So if you're still here, you're not just a listener anymore. You're part of this transmission. Speak the phrase once more in the comments. I see the shadow behind the smile. Then disappear. Let them wonder